Recently, I was asked a question concerning churches closing or having to postpone their services, having to cancel their services in light of the coronavirus, in light of the quarantines and various states have set up. And anyways, I'm glad to talk about it. I'm glad to discuss that. It is a hard question in a lot of ways to answer. And I want to get into some of the reasons why. In some senses, it's kind of hard. In some senses, we find certainly where God has allowed us the ability to think, ability to reason, the ability to choose, and certainly all those things come to mind. Even by saying that, some people may be surprised. They say, well, God gave you the ability to choose something. Yes, he did. And he gave us the ability to think. He gave us the ability to use our brains. And we need to consider these things well. Specifically, the question had to do with churches closing. What about churches closing indefinitely, it says, and not worshiping? What about worship being moved online and not in a building? And so what about that? Well, there's, like I said, several aspects to this. I want to talk about several of them. The first thing I want us to notice is this. Again, the question was, what about churches closing indefinitely? What about churches not worshiping or moving their worship online and so forth? And they're asking me, what about that? First thing I want to say is that I can't address what other people do. I really can't address what others do, what their decisions might be, or all of that. That falls into the realm of autonomy. The word autonomy means self-rule or self-governing. And God made every local congregation autonomous. You see this in 1 Peter chapter 5, for example. 1 Peter chapter 5, in the first two verses, here's Peter writing, saying, the elders which are among you I exhort, which also am an elder. And he said, I'm a witness of the sufferings of Christ and a partaker of the glory which shall be revealed. Now, verse 2 says, feed the flock. Some versions say shepherd the flock. King James says, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. Now, there's several clues in there that he describes for us. We see that the church, local church, is autonomous. You'll notice here he talks to elders and he says that I'm an elder and I'm talking to you elders, and I want you to know that you need to feed the flock of God which is among you. In other words, you have responsibility within that congregation. You need to shepherd, you need to feed the flock. And 1 Peter 5 there, and that's your responsibility as elders. It's not the responsibility of elders to feed, 4, 5, 6 other flocks, or to oversee those, but rather to oversee the flock over the which they have been overseers. He said the Holy Ghost has made you overseers. You see this also in Philippians chapter 1 and verse number 1, where Paul describes the fact that the Philippians there had elders, deacons, and saints. He talks about Paul and Timotheus, the servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints which are Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. And bishops is just another description of the work of elders or overseers in a congregation. But I want you to notice that here these elders they were over the church at Philippi. They weren't over other churches, other places. They weren't responsible for other congregations and what they did or didn't do. But we find that they were responsible for the congregation over which they were overseeing, the ones they were in charge of, if you will. The word rule is used, Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7, verse 17, and other places, and I believe that's a correct terminology to talk about elders ruling in a congregation, but it'd be over that one particular congregation and not many. It's self-governing or autonomous. And so that's something that needs to be remembered. So if somebody says, well, what about so-and-so church is doing over here, doing over there? I don't know. And quite frankly, it's none of my business in that sense. You say, well, can't you preach the truth? Well, sure you can. You preach the truth everywhere. Truth transcends autonomy. Truth transcends everything. But so far as a group of elders making a decision in a congregation that I'm not a member of, and somehow saying that now I'm responsible for what they did, I don't think so. That somehow I'm responsible for their decisions and whether I agree or not, no. And so each congregation is autonomous or self-governing. That's the first thing. The second thing is this. I'm aware of the fact that congregations are not meeting in their building right now. There are, well, different states that have said that during this time, we really wish you'd not meet together because you got so many. We really wish that you would, not meet in that particular building where there's not a lot of room, perhaps for stretching out or for having a larger, as it's being termed, social distance now, where we'd like for you to keep at least 6 feet away. Well, a lot of times church buildings, a lot of times government buildings, a lot of times even places of employment are really not geared that way. And so some folks have lost their jobs, or at least we'd say they're laid off from their jobs for a while, because they said there's really no way for us to keep 6 feet distance between everyone and still do the work that's necessary to do. There are some government agencies and government offices and such that have had to stop. I know of one in particular where the government building locks its doors every day. And the only ones allowed in are those who have a job and they have their little desk or cubicle and they can work there. And this other person's over here. And then we go lock the doors so that the public is not allowed in. The reason for that is, of course, to keep that distance. Well, not everything is conducive to that, and that includes jobs, certain employers. That includes, some of our doctors and such, some of the medical community. I know of folks in the medical community that they can't operate, literally, they can't operate right now because we're too close. And so, unfortunately, congregations of God's people fit in that category. That is to say, if you want to come together in this particular church building, we're going to have an issue. We're going to have a problem. Now, what they're trying to do is to help control the spread of the virus, the coronavirus. They're trying to help control that. And so what happens is you say, well, if there's less contact with people, all right, then perhaps there can be less chance of this contagion going to the next person, the next, et cetera, et cetera. The idea, less contact means less death. And I can appreciate that. And some people oppose this, and perhaps the person who asked the question might oppose this, and it doesn't specifically say in the question, but perhaps somebody opposes this, and I know I'm talking to some that might do this, and they say, well, but really it's a government thing, so therefore it's government persecution upon the church, and really you shouldn't be giving in to government persecution. To that I would respond and say, well, first of all, understand that the rules that have been made are not federal. They are state, and vary state by state by state. And so that's the first thing. It is not wholesale government persecution. The federal government really is not behind it. It's the states that are making these kinds of decisions. And if you paid attention to the news, every state has done different things. They have made different decisions, and some people have been kind of surprised that some states are slower moving than perhaps others. That's why it's a thing. It's such as that. The second thing is this. I don't hear federal, state, county, or otherwise of anyone ever stopping Christians from worshiping. And I don't even hear of anything being said where it's stopping Christians from public worship. If you paid attention at all, you have seen congregations of God's people. You've seen, and all across this nation, maybe some of them say they meet in the parking lot of the church building, and each one is in their separate car, listening on maybe maybe they got amplifier speakers and such, or maybe it's the little FM station, whatever it might be. But folks, that's public. That's just as public as anything. And so the idea that our government has somehow forbid worship or forbid public worship, even that hadn't happened. I mean, let's look at this rationally. And again, it doesn't make me happy. It doesn't give me any joy at all to think that where I go and worship in the congregation of which I'm a member, we can't meet together inside that building. That doesn't make me happy. It doesn't make me joyous. But also I have to look at it and say the government did not say, listen, there is no worship ever for anyone ever again. Don't you mention the name Jesus. Don't you worship Jesus. Don't you worship God. Don't you do anything of any religion. That's not what happened. What happened was they said, listen, you need to stop meeting in that building for a while because you can't get far enough away from each other that you're not going to spread this, not only to you, to your family, to others. And of course, whenever you leave that place, then all the people that you see otherwise in the community and so forth. And so I said, wish you just please don't do that. Don't meet there. And again, what's stopping you from meeting in a parking lot? What is stopping you from meeting at a park? What is stopping you from meeting at somebody's house? What is stopping you from meeting in other places? I'll tell you what's stopping you. Absolutely nothing. So whenever you talk about this, what about the churches closing and not worshiping? That's the first half of this question. This not worshiping business. I'm going to take issue with that because I want to say I know of congregations that very much are worshiping, and they're worshiping in a very public manner. And again, think about the advertisements and the other things that's done via social media and other places, videos and all kinds of things that's being done. And there's been nothing by the government to stop that. This is not government persecution, okay? This is nothing that rivals Roman persecution, all right? That's not what's happening at all. And so please put that out of your mind. Now, yes, you go in your Bibles and you read Acts chapter 5 and verse 29. And he talks about we ought to obey God rather than men. I also read in Romans chapter 13 in the first two verses how that the government, the powers that be, are ordained of God. He said they come from God. And so I have to have a way to harmonize those two passages. Are there times when God's will and man's will are in conflict? Yes. When that happens, what do? You choose God's way. Now, is that for every single law of man? Absolutely not. So let's find a way to harmonize this. And again, whenever you think about the current law that says, we really need to have you in quarantine, we really need you to not meet together in this enclosed building where we know you can't stay 6 feet apart from each other. Is that government persecution? I don't think so. Now, sometimes people talk about the slippery slope, and if you want to go that direction, you can go that direction, but you're going to go without me. We're going to have to deal with what is. This is what is going on, and it is an emergency. More on that in a moment. So did the government forbid worship? Absolutely not. Well, somebody says, I just don't think you need to listen to the government about this, and I just don't think that you need to do this. They might have told you whatever, but you don't need to be listening to the government. Okay, fine. What gets me, though, is on this subject, and this is kind of like point 2A here, what gets me about that is whenever you built the building that you have been meeting in, when you built that building, did you listen to the government then? When you built the building in the first place, were there not government rules, regulations? You had to have maybe so many receptacles in the wall. You had to have so many light switches. You had to have so many doors. You have to have an emergency door. You had to, when you had the water line, you had to have water. You had to have a sewer or a septic tank. Did you follow those rules? The builders who built that building, did they put a septic tank outside somewhere, or is it hooked onto the sewer, whatever the case may be, wherever that building might be located? Did you have running water? Is there a bathroom inside? Whenever you buried the water lines, did they bury them down 4 feet deep? I mean, really, did they do those things? Because all those things are government regulations. They're regulations that are necessary to build a building. Did you have an inspector inspect the building? Or maybe your building's so old, and this can happen. Maybe your building is so old it was before all that, but you've had an addition put on the building. In the addition that you put on the building, I ask those same questions. Did you do that then? I imagine you're going to say yes to all those questions. I imagine you say, well, yes, we have those things, but preacher, don't you understand? That's for our safety. We don't want the building to burn down, so we have certain electrical codes that we follow. We want to have water, and we don't want to freeze in the wintertime, and we don't want to have access to running water and all that. It's about safety, preacher. Don't you understand? This is about safety with those things. Well, what do you think this latest rule is about? What do you think this latest rule that's being discussed is going on? It's because we're trying to keep people safe and keep you from dying from a disease, or number two, spreading it to somebody. You might live, but what if you spread it to grandma and kill her? Okay? What if you spread it to somebody else? See, that's the point. And we need to understand that. So when somebody says, what about these churches closing indefinitely? What about all this? Well, that's where this comes from. We need to think logically, and need to think rationally about this. Why would someone do this? And again, you say, well, there's a conspiracy on. Well, maybe there is, and if we get to that point, then we'll deal with that too. But this is not a conspiracy. Listen to me. Nobody conspired and made a virus that has killed all these people. Okay. Now I know some people want to disagree with me, but if you want to be wrong, that's your business. But I'm telling you, this wasn't a conspiracy. This is a result of people it's just disease that happens. It's kind of like the 100-year flood. All right. This is the 100-year disease. Go back 100 years and what do we have? Spanish flu. You can go back beyond that, and what was there? Well, there's the Black Plague and other things like this that folks had, and well, it's the same idea. And so when we think about it's just diseases that go on, and smart people will deal with it in a way to hold down the contagion. We need to pray about it. We need to pray for the doctors and nurses. We need to pray for the researchers that are trying to figure out what medicines might work to stop this and to hold it back. That's what we need to do. And that's really where we need to go with this. James 5 verse 16 tells us that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Folks, that's what it's about. Now, you look on and you say, well, again, this question, churches closing indefinitely, and they're not worshiping, and they worship online. Well, different states regulate in different ways. There's some people that's meeting right now. There are some congregations that are meeting, and I'm aware of some that they are meeting. They're able to do it, whether the state or they're complying by whatever rules and so forth, and they can do it. And again, so to have a wholesale, everybody's quit, everybody's stopped, it's all online. That's really not what this is about. But I want you to go back for a moment. Why would we discourage folks from meeting in the church building? Why would you discourage folks from meeting in the church building? Why would that be something we think would be important? Could I suggest to you, basically from this perspective, and I want to ask it this way. What would you do in a blizzard? If there was a blizzard that came up on a Saturday night, late Saturday night and into Sunday morning, what do you think that the elders of your congregation might do? What might they suggest? If it was an ice storm, if it's down in Florida and other places like this where you get hurricanes, what are you going to do then? What happens when a tornado goes through and it goes through, you live in Tornado Alley, and it goes through and boom, your building is destroyed because the tornado hit that building? What are you going to do then? You're going to say, well, we're going to meet in that spot anyways. If it's a blizzard, are you going to get out in it? Are you going to encourage grandma, and you're going to encourage, 90-year-old Uncle Joe to get out in his Plymouth and get out in the 3 feet and 5 feet of snow? Are you going to do that? You say, well, I wouldn't do that kind of thing. Why? It's an emergency. It's an emergency, and it's bad weather, and it's inclement, and you just can't get. Well, you could hurt yourself. You could hurt somebody else. That's the point. Folks, listen to me. What's going on right now is a snowstorm without the snow. This is an emergency. It's an emergency time, and we need to respect that. That's why you have congregations that are saying, we don't need to meet right now. And what they're saying is not cancel worship, not cancel. They're just saying we can't meet in this building. We're too close to each other. It's too much of an opportunity to get sick. So let's go somewhere. Let's meet in another fashion, another form. Or maybe we have to meet at home. Maybe we have to meet online. Maybe we have to do other things that keeps this virus down. That's what it is, folks. It's a snowstorm without the snow. I mean, look at the deaths. Are you listening to the death toll that we hear, the reports we hear day by day? Are we listening to that? Think about it. If there was a road out somewhere, and here's this road that's out, and people are driving, and even there's signs up that say, listen, don't go on this road. The road's out, and it's you'll fall into a deep chasm here, and it's been washed away. You're going to fall in a deep chasm. You're going to hurt yourself or die going in that place. But it's the road that you take whenever you go on Sunday to meet with the brethren, and it's the road that you take to meet in that church building. Are you going to keep on driving? Are you going to just keep on going and say, listen, you just got to go and keep on driving and just fall right in that pit if you need to, because if you love the Lord, well, you'll just drive off the road? Is that what you're going to do? Or would you back up and say, maybe there's a detour? Maybe there's another way around this that I can get to the same spot, but get there safely. Jesus teaches his disciples to be wise as serpents and harmless or innocent as doves. That is a poetic way of saying, use your brain. God gave you a brain, and he intended for you to use it. He gave you a brain to think and to reason and to look at the situations as is. Let's respect that, and let's understand this is a time for that. We haven't had a coronavirus. We haven't had a quarantine. We haven't had anything like this in modern man's history. You understand? I'm saying the last 100 years, but how many 100-year-old plus people do we actually know? I mean, people. It's interesting, and I'll throw this in for free. It's interesting. I've been talking to some folks here recently that are in their late 80s, 90s. Obviously, they didn't live through the Spanish flu, but their parents did. Their grandparents did. And it's interesting, as I talked to them about that, I said, do you remember your parents talking about the flu and the quarantines and all that? Do you remember that? And I found it interesting because they said, well, no, I don't really remember that kind of thing. We were too busy living through the Depression to ask many questions, I guess. So they said, but if you go back, historical record shows there was quarantines, and there was times the state governments and different ones was asking churches, listen, please don't meet together for a while, and then we'll get through this and you'll be back meeting once more. That's all this is. Okay? So let's be wise as serpents, and let's be harmless as doves about this situation. That was going to go a long way. But again, you look back to this question, and this I'm answering it from several angles, and I hope that some of these might help. What about these churches that close, and he uses the term closes indefinitely? I don't know of any church that's closed indefinitely through this virus deal. And he says they're closed and they're not worshiping. And then he says worship was moved online and not in a building. Okay, so what about that? So here my question is this. In response to that question, I have a question. Since when in New Testament days has worship ever been regulated to a building or to one place anyways? Since when? Jesus talked about this in John chapter 4. In John chapter 4, verse 20 down through verse 24, we read where Jesus was speaking to the woman at the well. And you remember whenever he was speaking to her, she got to asking about, well, our father's saying this mountain, that's Mount Gerizim, in this mountain we're supposed to worship, and you saying Jerusalem is the place to worship. And she's kind of saying like, well, you choose a mountain and we choose a mountain. You go to your mountain and we'll go to our mountain and everything will be fine. I mean, after all, who can decide? Who knows? It's just up in the air. Jesus said in John chapter 4, verse 20 down to verse 24, he said, she had said, our fathers worship in this mountain, and you say in Jerusalem is the place men ought to worship. 21. Jesus said, woman, believe me, the hour cometh when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship, you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, verse 23, the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. He says that God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And again, Acts 17, verse 24, when Paul was at Athens, and he ran into so many people there that were, following false gods and this and that. And he told them, he said, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Folks, maybe it's time we got back and remembered that. Well, what about the church building? Well, the Lord's money was used to buy that building, yes. The Lord's money was used, and we need to respect that. But we have the wrong idea if we think that the only time you can worship, or the only way that worship can be done, is going to be inside that building, okay? Because that's completely wrong. That is not a true statement. God never taught it, and the New Testament never teaches that one bit, that it has to be in certain building in order for worship to take place. Now, before we run away from this, I understand the Bible says in Hebrews 10 and verse 25, he said, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, so much more as you see the day approaching. I understand 1 Corinthians 11, verse 18 and verse 20, where he talks about when you gather together into one place. There's no question that you gather into one place. But does it mean it has to be in that building to be one place? Does it have to be there? Like I said a moment ago, what about someone's house? What about in the parking lot? What about in somebody's yard if you promise to maintain that distance? What about in a barn? What about, as the old timers used to say, what about, down in the grape arbors, the brush arbor meetings and so forth? What about all that? Was that not okay? Was that somehow wrong because you didn't meet in a building, or didn't meet in a specific structure in town? Well, I imagine anyone watching this would say, well, of course you can. You can meet in somebody's house, or like I said, in the parking lot, or a city park, or a barn, or brush arbor, or wherever you want to. You can do that. Well, sure you can. In Acts chapter 16, Paul met a bunch of women down by the river. And there they learned the truth. They believed it. They obeyed it. Read Acts 16, verse 13 and 14. He baptized them into Christ. Well, right there's the river. That'd been easy to baptize them. So he baptized them into Christ. And they met there for a while until Paul got put in prison. Paul and Silas got put in prison. And you know what happened when they got in prison? Acts 16, verse 25. It says at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises to God, and the prisoners heard them. I wonder what they were doing in that prison cell. I have a sneaking suspicion that 16:25, that was worship, and they were worshiping where? Worshiping right in the prison cell. You can move on. Think about Paul on the ship. You think of Paul, he was on the prisoner ship different times. The one I'm thinking of was when he was on the prisoner ship in Acts chapter 27. And there they were for 40 days and nights on the ship, having not eaten anything. And yet he was there. You think Paul wasn't worshiping? Or he didn't worship God there in some form or fashion? See, worship can take place in a parking lot, in a brush arbor, in a barn, on a ship, in a prison cell. at the riverside. It can take place in a lot of places, but how about this? What about online? See, if my congregation, the congregation of which I'm a member, if we agree to meet at 9 a.m. and all the brethren meet in a electronic way, and we meet online, and I see everyone and they see me, and we agree to meet at 9 a.m. when we are going to sing, pray, and study together, and do so in spirit and in truth. I want to ask you something. Was that a sin? And if it is a sin, I want to ask you, how in the world could that be a sin? How's that wrong? How's that sinful? How's that against God? If we meet together in spirit and in truth, and due to a virus, we had to make a way, another way, and because of the separation of miles, we agree, let's meet at 9 a.m. online where we can sing and pray and study together. Is that worship? If not, why not? Do you have to be in that building over there on Main Street, in that building over there at at the corner of Second and Third, do you, or whatever, Second and Jones Street, whatever you want to call it? Do you have to be in that building? See, that's kind of what this fellow was implying in this. Why that worship was removed from online? It wasn't in a building. Well, why? Well, okay. Why not? Where is it? Where's the issue? You say, well, you can't take the Lord's Supper. Well, no, I agree. We cannot take the Lord's Supper electronically. I understand that is not possible to put bread through the wires, and it's not possible to put that through the air. I understand that. And it doesn't make me happy. It doesn't make me pleased to say, well, I'm not able to eat the Lord's Supper with my brethren on the Lord's day. But I want to ask you something. Is this emergency any different than somebody being in the hospital or somebody being in the nursing home? Somebody that is shut in. You know, we talk about our shut-ins. Is a shut-in forsaking God and forsaking worship because they cannot get out? Is somebody in the hospital forsaking because they can't get out of the hospital on a Sunday? I mean, think about that. Somebody in a nursing home, same idea. And so whenever we're all essentially shut in that sense, when we're all essentially told, listen, you know, for an emergency and for the need of holding this contagion down, please don't get together. Please don't do this and hurt yourself and hurt others. Then are we not in that same boat? Think about it. You know, God won't hold us responsible for something that's physically impossible for us to do. Now, we used to understand that. Someone was had a speech problem and couldn't speak. If they wanted to confess Christ, then they could go like this. We accepted that as that's their confession because they can't speak for whatever reason. You know what? Whenever you have someone who they might be 25 years old, but their mind is mentally at 3 years old. Is that person guilty of sin? We used to understand that they're not guilty of sin. Their body may be 25 years old, but their mind is just like a 3-year-old. They're innocent. They're an innocent person. There's no way they could have committed sin. God doesn't hold you responsible for the things that are out of your control. And it's kind of the same way here. God's not going to hold you responsible for things you cannot control. You know what? Somebody says, well, I can control it because I will go and I will break the law and I will go and meet, and anyone that wants to meet, they can meet, and we'll just do this and break the law when we do it. Well, like I said, you can. Physically, you can do that, but shouldn't you do what the law says when the law in this case is trying to keep you alive and keep you healthy? I'm impressed with the fact that Paul followed the law. You remember we was talking about Acts chapter 16 a minute ago, In Acts chapter 16, him and Silas were put in prison. And then whenever it came time to be released, they asked him, they said, would you just, it sounded like, would you go out the back door, please? Because what had happened was these people understood, Paul made them understand, you did this illegally. I'm a Roman, and you shouldn't have beat me, and you shouldn't have done all these awful things to me and put me in prison. I didn't even have a trial. I didn't have anything. You were wrong. And so it scared him. Paul was in his rights as a Roman citizen. But the next thing, as you read the tail end of Acts chapter 16, the next thing was they did say, would you just please leave? You know what he did? He didn't go back into town, jumping up and down, screaming, saying, I want my rights. They asked him to leave, and he said, I'll go. And so he even followed the law in that case. There's times for following the law. There's times for following the recommendations of medical people. There's times for following those that understand about contagion and about viruses and things. It's not persecution. It is not hatred against religion or religious people. It's not hatred against Jesus. Now, I'm not saying those people don't exist, because they do, but I'm saying these types of laws and things, that's not what that's about. And so if we can just kind of hold our nose and wait, serve God daily, worship, we can still worship. You can still worship him. We can still talk to people about the Lord, talk to people about the truth and about salvation. Do it daily. Do it on social media. Do it by phone, text, in every public way. Do it. Write it down. Put it in sky letters, put it in skywriting. Whatever you want to do, put it out there and let folks know about the Lord. And then when we can come back together, what a glorious time that will be, and what a blessed time that will be, because we can come together as God's people and worship together, not just online, but actually worship together physically in one place and worship him in spirit and in truth. And what a glorious time that will be. You know what? I kind of, you see a connection with that, and see a connection with that great day coming whenever we, all God's people finally get to go to heaven. And what a grand and great and wonderful reunion that is. We're separated now by more than miles. We're separated because some have passed on, and we remain behind. But there's going to be a great and a grand and a glorious and wonderful reunion. And what a day that will be. And I'm going to tell you something, here for too long, there will be a great reunion in this country when God's Christians, God's people, can come together once more physically together into a place. And what a foretaste of heaven that will be, and we can be together once more. Well, that's what we have to say, and we appreciate your attention. Appreciate the fact that you've listened, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Thank you very much.